All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Book Talk series. What a great full room, full Zoom room as well. It's great to see so many people here celebrating Professor Simon's new book. I'm Teresa Miguel Stearns. I'm the Associate Dean and Director of the Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library. Welcome to our final book talk of the fall semester. This afternoon's book talk, faculty book talk, features Professor Diana Simon in conversation with Professor Susie Salmon. They'll be discussing Professor Simon's first and new book, the not too serious Grammar, Punctuation, and Style Guide to Legal Writing. Professor Diana Simon is Associate Clinical Professor of Law here at the University of Arizona, where she currently teaches legal writing, analysis, persuasion, and advocacy. Professor Simon has been teaching at the law school for over 25 years and has taught various classes to first, second, and third year law students. She brings with her 23 years of experience as a practicing attorney. During those years, she has developed expertise in entertainment-related litigation, including copyright, trademark, as well as other areas such as general contract litigation, insurance coverage, and employment law. While this is her first book, she has written several articles since going full-time as a professor in 2019 and is currently ranked in the top 3% of SSRN downloads. Professor Simon also has a regular feature in Arizona Attorney, the state's magazine for Arizona lawyers, called True Confessions of a Writing Professor, where she comments with great wit, I might add, on grammar and punctuation issues. If you haven't read this, I promise you'll never look at it. In addition to duty for the University of Arizona, she is a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis and Emory Law School, where she was notes and comments editor for the Emory Law Journal. Our interlocutor is Professor Susie Salmon, Director of Legal Writing, Clinical Professor of Law, and Distinguished Public Service Scholar. Professor Salmon received her BA in English from UCLA and graduated magna cum laude from the University of California, Hastings College of Law. After 9 years in civil litigation practice in California and Arizona, she joined the College of Law full-time in 2010 and has directed this college's top-ranked legal writing program since 2017. Professor Salmon's scholarship focuses on equity and inclusion. It explores how traditional practices and values in legal education affect access to justice, bias in the profession, and lawyer and law student well-being, as well as how legal rhetoric can exacerbate or mitigate existing injustices. She is particularly interested in dissenting opinions, and her current project focuses on how lawyers can and do use dissent effectively. Professor Salmon's work has appeared in various flagship law reviews and legal writing journals. She has written several book chapters, and she co-authored the Moot Court Advisor book, the second edition of which will be published next fall. A national leader in the legal writing discipline, she served a term on the board of Association of Legal Writing Directors and is currently president of the Legal Writing Institute, the largest organization of legal writing scholars in the world with over 1,000 members. For many years, Professor Salmon wrote a column in Arizona Attorney magazine, and she is an unrepentant grammar nerd. So please join me in congratulating Professor Simon on the publication of her new book, and thank you, Professor Simon and Salmon, for joining us today. You came to the village to write a book, so I have some thank yous before we begin. First of all, I want to thank the Academy. Thank you, friends. Thank you, colleagues, former students, some came from Phoenix, family, colleagues for coming today and showing your support. And thank you, Teresa. I know I drove you crazy, and Nikki and Hannah getting this already. We love you, Diane. Yeah. And I'm going to go in chronological order, working backwards. So the first thing that happened in my writing career is that I attended a writing conference and presented on plagiarism, which is ended up why all of you had to take that plagiarism
online course this year. But after I spoke, Richard Newman, who's a distinguished professor at Hofstra University, came up to me and said, you really should write an article on that. And so I think Tom and Mike said the same thing, but the emphasis on the should sounded more like a directive, so I was never going to do it. But Richard Newman has written at least 5 books, 8 articles, weekly to the text for many years. And so that got me started, that article, and I've never stopped writing since. Next, I want to thank Tim Igo, who's on Zoom. He's editor of the Arizona Attorney Magazine, our state bar magazine. I wrote my first in-depth article on semicolons. The semicolons suck, true confession as a writing professor. And notwithstanding that, Igo published it, and for some reason keeps publishing my articles. So he was really appreciated my voice and showed in me. So that, of course, spurred me on. Next is David Kersey, who's here on Zoom, acquisitions editor at Carolina Academics Press, for agreeing to publish my book, even though it's way outside the mainstream legal style guide. And next, my students. I want to thank Molly, stand up for a second, and Danny. With manual, and they did an amazing job putting together some creative activities, sticking to the theme of the book, and did so in short order. So thank you so much for your help on that. And then my colleagues, the whole writing team. I don't know where they are. You're supposed to be there. They all are. Okay. What color? My color. For my cover. But especially Professor Salmon and I, who put up with 5,000 emails from me, and those students of mine know that I'm not exaggerating about the number of emails. And Professor Lett, who day in and day out really encouraged me at times when I can't do this. Only 2 more people to thank. Liam, will you please stand up? You were supposed to wear your t-shirt, but you didn't. My student in my 1L fall semester, my writing fellow, my senior writing fellow. He actually wrote the problem that the 1Ls are going to be working on in the spring. So he will be supplying his email address if you have any. But he read every word of my book. He worked on every single citation. I think he actually tried to graduate and get away. But also, if you have any issues with the book, please see Liam on that. Not least is my husband, Don Tringali, who read every word and supported me throughout. And in fact, if you ask him, he wrote the book and he should be the one.
All right. Well, first, I have to preface all of this by saying that I read the manuscript for this book on a flight, and a couple of months ago, and I moved through it really quickly, and I literally laughed out loud several times. I think everyone on the plane thought I was a little unhinged, and it was even more unhinged to realize I was reading a book on grammar and silence. So, what inspired you to write a book like this, one that uses humor to talk about subjects that most people think of as fairly dry?
So I always wanted to be a stand-up comedian, but that failed, although I never tried. It's about grammar and punctuation. That's the best option. And also I researched and wrote an article a few years ago about laughter and learning, and there's a whole body of literature out there that says if you teach with laughter in the right amounts, etc., and the right time, that helps relieve student anxiety and can actually promote learning. So I figured I'd have something there by using humor. I also used humor to prove my husband wrong, which is the motivation behind a lot of writing I do. I'm not funny when I'm trying to be, and I am funny when I'm not trying to be. So I'm actually trying to be funny when I'm trying to be.
And teachers of legal writing and advocacy, we teach our students about the importance of storytelling. And in fact, there's a whole sub-discipline in legal writing scholarship focused on applied legal storytelling. So can you talk a little bit about how and why you use story in your book?
So we know that cognitive theory teaches us that the brain cannot process abstract concepts and abstract rules. So you can get your point across better with storytelling and narrative, which is why this semester in my class, we talked about storytelling and how a case illustration is nothing more than a story about a rule. So I figured the same theory should apply to grammar and punctuation. So in this book, the punctuation marks take on the role of characters. They have nicknames and they have histories. Take the hyphen as an example. There's a movement up front to eliminate the hyphen, which is very fast for the hyphen. In fact, in 2007, 16,000 words that formerly had hyphens have obliterated the hyphen in those words. And courts can't agree on when to use that. And I give an example of a legal doctrine, the work for hire doctrine, well recognized, that where the Supreme Court uses hyphens, but the Ninth Circuit doesn't use hyphens to refer to the same doctrine. I also talk about Justice Scalia, who was actually interviewed a lot on the importance of hyphens, where he talks about people eaters and how, depending on where you put the hyphen, the meaning of that phrase can change. So the book goes well beyond, oh, here's when you use a hyphen.
So you and I have worked together a long time, about a dozen years, and over that time, I've come to realize that you're kind of a provocateur. Saying outrageous things, or maybe just saying things without outrageous. So definitely heard that voice in my head. That was in my book. So with that.
So here and on Zoom who can attest to the fact that we, our family, some members of our family thrive on Zoom. Time, I can't help it, and I wish I could be someone else most of the time. So I know when I look at that, straw readers, I figured if an article was titled semicolon, I would never read it, but you call it True Confessions of a Writing Professor, semicolon suck, people would read that. And as it turned out, my instinct about that was right. I got a very strong reaction from readers. People wrote letters to the editor. Student and former writing fellow works at the AG's office, and apparently her supervisors contacted her after that article and said, "What in the heck are they teaching over here?" And acted as if she had never heard of me, and then wrote a whole article in Arizona Attorney refuting my article, but no.
So speaking of Arizona Attorney magazine, it strikes me that the audience for this book is much broader than just law students. So what audience do you have in mind when you're writing?
So my main audience is writing professors and students really in any year of law school, but because of the subject matter, I knew it would have a broader appeal. Really anyone involved in writing that somehow touches on the law. For example, I knew that lawyers would be interested given the amount of interest in my semicolon article. Further, for any student that touches the law, a BA in law student, an MLS student, an AJD student, an LLM student, they could benefit from learning about all these style matters as well. And my husband, who's a transactional lawyer and teaches contract drafting here, as he read every chapter, he said, "Wow, this would be good advice for any transactional lawyer as well, or anyone even drafting legislation too."
So I noticed that you used quite a bit of case law in some of the chapters. to make your point about the importance of these grammar stuff. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that?
So I think the litigator in me, for those of my students, the people on crack, that I am, is always there to try to persuade people that, and persuade people in my position. And in this situation, I wanted to persuade students that these punctuation and grammar matters really do matter to courts, and have real life consequences in terms of litigation. That way, if the student figures, I don't really care about this, this isn't important to me, I think the cases, seeing case law can help them realize this does really matter.
That strikes me as one of the real strengths of the book. I can see it really helping, like you say, to persuade law students and lawyers that mastering these rules is a good use of their already overtaxed time. But do you worry that this use of cases limits your audience to people who have at least knowledge?
I don't think so, because it was written in a way that is multiple audiences. The case concessions are easy to understand, and I think even a PA law student, think about it, first-year law students are not that far ahead from PA and law students, or one semester ahead. And I also think everyone's interested in the law, which is like why shows like Law and Order and Suits are so popular. So a lot of people care about these issues.
So you decided that you were going to write a book on grammar, style, and punctuation, largely targeting law students, and you were going to include humor and anything else. So what aspects of that endeavor were most challenging?
I think one of the most challenging things was figuring out which topics should be addressed. This book is not meant to replace the Red Book, which is much more comprehensive and more encyclopedic and addresses everything you would ever want to know. My book is not meant to do that, but I did go into a much deeper dive into each issue. And my second challenge was how to express my views on the subject without being too prescriptive, because those of you that are my students, you know I'm not very prescriptive at all. I let you kind of do whatever you want. But I wanted my readers to know, here is my view, but pay attention to your audience, whether that's a court, a supervisor, or a client.
Well, how did you decide what subjects to include and which subjects to omit? I noticed, for example, that you included semicolons, no surprise, commas, and passive voice, but you didn't include, for example, anything on nominalizations, which is one of my big pet peeves.
Yeah, so that does kind of tie into passive voice, which I didn't talk about. But in general, the topics I selected were those mistakes that I've seen my students make over 25 years of teaching, and I think I covered about 99%.
You talk a little bit about how you discussed both sides of the debate. What do you mean by that? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one side, clarity, comma, forever, like.
Okay, so you're talking about the serial comma. It's the most polarizing of punctuation marks. So I think about every punctuation mark. People can't even agree on what to call it, whether it's the Oxford comma or the serial comma. And even though it's not the comma, because of its birthplace of the University of Oxford Press, ironically, people in Britain don't use it. And actually, people have been told about Americans about their views on the serial comma, but to find out the results of that poll, you'll have to read my book. That's the apostrophe, which I relate to well because I'm very possessive. My friends on here and my friends here, and my husband knows this too. But I wrote this hypothetical a few years ago. Maybe there were some students in here that did that on, it was based on Game of Thrones, and there were a lot of nouns and characters in that story whose names ended in S, which meant chaos ensued as far as the use of the exactly apostrophe. But the rule under Red Book is very simple. If a singular noun ends in S or double S, you tack on an apostrophe S. So no controversy, right? but it turns out it's much more complicated. The apostrophe is actually a political animal. Because, and in Canada, the apostrophe is viewed as a symbol of anal imperialism. So pressure exists there to omit apostrophes. St. Mary's River in Canada, for example, does not have an apostrophe, along with a lot of towns for that reason. But you don't even have to go as far as Canada, because in Arkansas, where no one used the apostrophe S, a bill was passed by the legislature, I'm not kidding you, declaring that the state's name should be Arkansas apostrophe S. People were up in arms about that. The use of apostrophe S either. There's actually been articles written. Where's Professor Dysart? Anyway, about that, and in the same Supreme Court opinion, you will see justices depart ways on this issue when talking about Kansas or Justice Thomas's dissent. Some just put the apostrophe and some put apostrophe S. Many other controversies exist. The M dash, semicolon, many others. Again, you'll have to read the book.
Speaking of debate, in researching the book, looked at a lot of real world. But in true Diana Simon form, you did not stop there. You basically cold called the authors of some of these briefs to ask them to defend choices. I just want to know how that went for you.
So, examples of briefs filed by the U.S. Solicitor General's office because their writing is top notch. I'm writing this chapter. And I make this big deal out of the fact that point headings should not be in all caps. In fact, courts have issued orders telling lawyers don't put them in all caps, and psychologists have done studies which show that people struggle reading point headings in all caps. And plus, we need to put a period after point headings because they are full sentences. Easy peasy. Then I started pulling some examples from the U.S. Solicitor General's briefs to prove this, and find out, well, they're using they are very proper full sentences. And so I figured, what the heck is going on with the U.S. Solicitor General's office? So I called the U.S. Solicitor. They have records. I don't know why it should be done. But I figured I will call the former U.S. Solicitor. Probably has more time. So to see the response and tells me why they did that. And they do it because not all point headings are full sentences. So he said to be consistent, we don't put periods after any of them. And he also said that how it's done. It's always been this way at the U.S. Solicitor General's office. So, which proves my point that when it comes to these issues, you have to pay attention to your audience and what they require.
So the market is flooded with grammar and style resources for law students. Interactive online exercises like core grammar for lawyers, which is actually also a product. Style manuals like the Red Book, which you mentioned, grammar software like Grammarly, and in fact, different College of Law writing programs, we use a lot of these. What does your book add to that tool?
So we've done research on it, and Pat has done research on it, and there's nothing in the market like this. There are three things that make it unique. First of all, the use of real cases to prove these issues matter. The use of humor. We have cartoons in every chapter. My storytelling techniques where punctuation marks take on a life of their own. And in my head, I was modeling this book after textbooks like Grammar Girl, Dryer's English, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they're bestsellers, which I don't mind because they're great, but then you learn about grammar and punctuation.
But what about those people who say, look, I don't have time for these stories, just tell me the rules so I can edit my book. So why should they still read your book?
This book is autobiographical, which I know sounds very weird and it's got great punctuation, but my mother taught journalism in English and was constantly on my case about correcting sentences and you need to learn this and that, and I basically didn't care about those rules at all. So it never stuck. But I think learning through these stories makes it more memorable.
So another fun little thing that you do in the book. So you specifically blame the Harry Potter series for a rise in the use of commonplaces.
Professor Griffin. Okay, so Professor Griffin and I got a grant of $1 million rise in common slices among students. That's it's a very time-intensive process, not at all. But when I was thinking about my son, Michael, we all heard, when he was little, I read Harry Potter to him, and he then, when he was older, read it too, on his own. And I was thinking of that generation, these millennials, that it started about then when the rise in comma slices started. So I started researching it, and actually a lot of English professors have studied Harry Potter and how many comma slices are in those books, and there's thousands of them. So I realized there must be something to this, and the Harry Potter generation, I'm sorry for the Harry Potter generation, I think it's a big, big generation. It's all J.K. Rowling's fault that there are comma slices.
Well, that's like that. Talk earlier about using controversies and the strong, passionate feeling people have about certain grammar, style, punctuation, right letters to the editor. We've also talked a little bit about how people like to do things the way we've always done them. I've been writing to be lawyers who rely on precedent or resistant to change. Who knew? But some grammar controversies are particularly sensitive. Can you talk a little bit about the use of the singular they and how you navigated that issue rather definitely and sensitively, I thought.
Okay, so the first thing I did was it was the only chapter that I had other people read besides me. Wanted to make sure that it was okay. And that issue is discussed in my chapter called Three Nouns Walk into a Bar, about matching nouns with pronouns generally, and it covers a lot of issues. But of course, we need to respect people's pronouns, whatever they are, as a matter of human dignity. The problem that I've seen over the course of the last several years is that the word they keeps popping up everywhere, even when referring to me, even referring with collected nouns that lawyers use all of the time, such as court, jury, Congress, corporation, etc., which that's not a matter of human dignity. Those are all its. So I wanted to write about that problem and some other issues within that chapter.
So for the legal writing professors out there who might be thinking about how they would use your book in class, do you envision a writing professor requiring students to read the entire book cover to cover over the course of the semester, or what would you think?
No, I'm only going to make my students read it cover to cover. The book has an organization because it first talks about punctuation marks and then it moves to style issues like capitalization, quotation, and parallelism, and then it addresses, stylistic matters like parallelism, active voice, and transitions, and it tackles explanatory parentheticals. But the way the book is written, each chapter is self-contained, so you don't have to read any other chapter to understand what's going on in the chapter. And this means professors have complete flexibility in terms of which chapters to assign and when. I know for my 1L class this semester, a lot of you are here, thank you for coming. We had issues, the royal we, with comma slices, punctuation with quotation marks, issues on point headings and parentheticals, which we did cover this semester. So I would have just assigned those chapters and those activities that are associated with that.
So as I said earlier, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I read the whole thing in one sitting, and I'm someone who's hard to about this when it comes to legal writing, I swear. So sorry. Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking and teaching and reading and writing about this, but in a way that made it even more, the book even more fun for me. And I learned some new things, but I also found the backstories and the pieces just fascinating. And some legal writing nerds, is that like a key audience for your book?
Absolutely, which I think is why my article about how semicolon stuff got so much attention by lawyers who care about these issues. The ones that spoke with Caitlin about that put a footnote in their article saying, we acknowledge that Professor Simon may not truly be the unequivocal anti-semicolon zealot. After the last year, period has been on a lighthearted topic, provided refreshing change of pace. And when I complained a little bit to Tim Igo, not complained, but I said, oh my God, these letters to the editor, and his response was, your articles are playful. You're kind of saying to people, jump in the pool and play with me. So this is what you can expect. Except don't play with me on my book. Right? We don't want that.
So I want to add a tangentially related question. So you are by any measure an extremely productive writer. In the 4 or so years that you've been a full-time professor, you've published 6 pieces in law reviews, 4 on issues related to legal writing or pedagogy, and 2 on other legal topics. You've published a number of shorter pieces, as you mentioned, in Arizona Attorney, and now you have this book. So aside from being awake to send emails to me at 3 a.m. on the what's your secret?
I think it's one of the few areas in my life where I can write in my own voice, which is why I tell my students, if you're frustrated with this whole pre-act and structure, go write whatever you want to write about and be free there. I didn't allow this goofy, sarcastic side to come out, and then it actually resonated with people. I think if it hadn't, I probably never would have written that second article. And I also get to write about what interests me. And so I think that's why.
So finally, last question, what's up with giraffe?
So there are 2 throughout my book, 1 for each chapter. My whole approach again was to make things stick, and I thought, what better way to make stories stick than with cartoons? So it's seeing a small cat dressed up as a veterinarian, because someone put the hyphen in the wrong place when referring to a small animal veterinarian. Look, his name is John Conrad. He couldn't be here today. He's in class. He's a junior at the University of Arizona. He's the cartoonist for the Daily Wildcat. He had some great ideas, and the draft was his idea. But it originated from a cartoon he wrote in the parallelism chapter. And on the chapter on parallelism, I was trying to think of what things in life are parallel. And I came across this thing called zebra crossing. Has anybody heard of zebra crossing? Ellen, of course you have. Yeah. Because they have them in New Zealand. Of course they do. Well, what is zebra crossing? Just don't correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, yeah, no, yeah. It's what the crosswalk called in England is called a zebra crossing for obvious reasons, because it's got the stripes. So in the book, the cartoon, but I was thinking about the giraffes, like there's nothing for giraffes to talk over. So the cartoon shows the zebra, but everything's zigzag, and the zebra's having trouble following it. But then you have a giraffe saying, you think you've got problems, I can't even see down there. And so that was the kind of, and it was actually the fortuitous idea to come up with this giraffe.
So with that, we'll open it up to questions. I see I already have one question on Zoom. And I assume this person, like me, is just asking for a friend. So do you think that people write grammar rules apply on some speech assignments? For example, if someone's in a hurry and writing a post, should she have to follow grammar rules? This is from Professor Dysart. I'm sure she's asking.
Okay, she's trying to get back at me because on a social media post, she used a comma slide. But it's from the Harry Potter generation. And so she tried to explain herself by saying this was social media. And I think Professor Salmon and I were like, yeah, but even there, because we're legal writing professors, I mean, I shudder when I make mistakes, any kind of mistake. I make them all the time, but I always shudder when I do. Yeah, if it is.
I do. We have a question in chat from Tim Igo, our wonderful editor, Arizona attorney, and he asks, headed into 2023, what are the explosive writing issues that Arizona attorneys will hear about? And have you considered
I should do a podcast, but Pat, where's Dave University? Day is going to continue to be an issue for a while. The Supreme Court has used it in some opinions to refer to a singular noun, and going back in history it was used. But I think there are still some circuits who are stubbornly refusing to adopt they, even when it comes to people whose pronoun is they. There are some examples of that in my book. So I think that will continue to be an issue for a while. As far as other issues, I can't really think of anything. I'm sure Professor Salmon has something in mind. I think that's probably. I mean, I think I have a whole article I wrote in Arizona Attorney on exclamation points and how we should get rid of exclamation points because everybody uses them all the time, and I've succumbed to this too. Every student I write, dear Jordan, exclamation point, you know, and I don't myself every time I do it. Acceptable. So, you know, I think on that are going to change emojis, and you know that there's a proliferation of that. So
Questions in the room for Professor Simon? Yes, Colette.
So what's your next book going to be about?
for article. I'm working on I have like 5 articles, but I'm going to do one on. I have to do one on periods and comments inside quotation marks because it's something that happened. My students are my best, like I think you say, just retire and write. And I'm like, you don't understand, my best material comes from my students. I cannot possibly do that. My students who I won't reveal their name, but raised their hand in class and said, it pointed out and pointing me, saying I was wrong, that irregardless actually is a word in the dictionary. And so I, of course, had to write a whole article about how dictionaries should not be a democracy. Those are the things that I am working on. I also want to write about email and responding to emails and what's appropriate. How promptly. Yeah.
This book would make a good Christmas gift for a young practicing attorney who gets spoken to about his or her writing.
I think it would be a great gift. I think you should get all of your friends. No, I'm like, I mean, the most complex that chapter is probably on explanatory technicals, and that's extremely helpful to any practicing lawyer out there. How long they're practicing, it's very helpful. So, and all of it is helpful because a number of lawyers have gotten bench slapped, which means in trouble with the forms, incomprehensible writing. So this is not necessarily limited. This is very experienced lawyers who are getting in trouble with the court. Yeah, JJ.
I guess this is the question more for your son, Michael. Does he use the comma splice because he is of the Harry Potter generation?
Michael, I'm afraid to answer that because my lovely daughter-in-law is also on here too. I would say that like my mother, I tried to correct him on. And he always says, you know, people in finance don't really care about that. So she was coming into his own and accepting things and becoming a beautiful, beautiful writer. So just like what happens, well, I'm not saying I'm a beautiful writer. It took me a while to get there.
Yeah, it's an easy answer. She taught me well. She taught me well.
Honey, you are a beautiful, right?
How do you feel about ending the sentence in a preposition?
Refuted by other things out there. So, which is why I say pay attention to your audience. So the way I was trained, you never do that. But I was trained on a lot of things that people do, and it's okay, like not starting a sentence with and not starting a sentence with but, or having a one sentence paragraph. But yet people say, and even, you know, expert legal writers say that's okay to do all of that. So when I see it, my eyebrows go up. I can't help it. But, you know, I think it's one of those things, language is evolving, and I think our usage is changing over time.
So it doesn't make you cringe.
It does. It does. But no more than like this semester hypothetical where all my students were saying jacked up immediately. But
I'm wondering if you find any legal rules, writing rules to be a bit unnecessary, like italicized periods.
I mean, I don't have, I do address something in my book, which is called cleaned up quotations, which you haven't learned about as first year students, but that's also somewhat controversial. It's been adopted by some people, not by other people, but that's another thing that's coming into vogue. But not, I don't really talk about blue book like citation issues so much. I leave that to the blue book and to Alwood. Hi, Professor Alwood, she's here. Yeah, Alwood a lot.
But you dodged the question, Diana.
What's wrong with that? I mean, a lot of these rules, you know, I think they're, I'm used to it. I've been used to it for many, many years. So I think it's kind of like the Solicitor General's office. You know, it's what you're used to. Yeah. So.
Was there anything that you really wanted to include in this book, but ultimately decided against when going through editing and revisions?
Not really. I wove in accuracy, brevity, and clarity throughout the book, but I think, you know, and so many legal style manuals talk about those topics. But part of me thought, could I have a chapter just on brevity, for example? But I think it wouldn't have fit in with the rest of the topics in the book. And maybe that would be like a fun book on that. I don't know. I don't know if there's storytelling in it.
300-page book on brevity.
Yeah.
From Professor Atwood. she asked, do you have a favorite writer on the US Supreme Court? I've been noticing that Justice Gorsuch likes to use contractions and familiar.
I don't really have a favorite writer, although for my book, I had to research articles written about their writing, like Justice Kavanaugh. There was an article written by a legal writing expert that he does the best job using substantive transitions as he moves from topic to topic. But no, I don't really have a favorite writer. I haven't studied that much. Sorry, Barbara. Professor Allen.
Which chapter was your favorite one to write?
Probably the comma slice one, and it's a Harry Potter and the chart that my husband created, showing the rise of comma slices, and like people thought this was actually scientific. And I think the other one was active voice and passive voice, because I set it up like if you were an election campaign and, you know, who would vote for active voice, who would vote for passive voice, and write like an action hero. So the title of that has to do with action heroes. Any other questions?
How do you think social media has impacted the next generation of writers, for better or for worse?
For worse. And I'm not just saying that because I'm opinionated. That was a lot of the research I did. And I researched not just legal writing style guides. I looked at New York Times. I looked at other publications. I looked at the other style guides outside of legal writing and looked at a lot of people commenting on grammar, people that care about that, including writing people and journalists. And a lot of why things are happening the way they are is because of social media. Because people, you don't want to use a lot of punctuation and grammar when you're sending a text. So I think it is, social media is to blame for that. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. A lot of people. No. Yeah, so
You've had a long career in teaching. What do you feel like is your strongest suit as a teacher of legal writing?
I would toss that back to my students here, who in fact, my student, Ed, stand up. If you remember. So,
Yes, you're that old.
so I think my strength is, I know it's tough, and I set high expectations, but weirdly, within that, I feel like I'm very approachable. And I know that's inconsistent, but I feel like people can talk to me easily, and I don't know why that is, but it's kind of because I'd be scared. But
the internet and new words and stuff, what role do neologisms play in the legal writing sphere?
Neologians.
New words.
Oh, new words. All of that. Words. I think they're, you know, I think it's going to be slow going to accept those words. I mean, the dictionaries are based on usage, not on necessarily. So people are using it even though it's wrong. It's going to show up in the dictionary. And so I think lawyers in the profession still have to, until there's a major sea change, still have to go by what the convention is in the profession. Like I know students in my dictionary article, one thing I talk about is the word anyways, which is another word that drives me crazy. It's not a word, but students use it. Now, mostly they're using it in emails and things like that, not in formal legal writing. But I think if people keep using it, it's going to show up in the dictionary. So I think like I said, it's gonna evolve and things are gonna, and I will learn things by my students slowly raising their hands and saying.
So we have one more question on Zoom real quick, from Hughes. He says, congratulations on the wonderful new book. I regrettably had to miss the start of the book talks, but we'll have to record it. If you did not already address this question, do you think the book's audience includes undergraduate law?
Absolutely. Do we have BA in law students here? I know we do. Jack, also you're BA in law, you are. So I think given that those undergraduate students are literally just months away from being in their first semester of law school, I think it would be appropriate for BA in law students. And I think because these are punctuate, those students, I think, Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't you very enthusiastic about everything law related in your BA program?
I was not a law BA.
Okay. Were you excited about law? You know, they're writing legal writing, right, in the BA and law program, and so these tips can be extremely helpful, particularly those who end up in law school and are going to be faced with the same kinds of punctuation and grammar and style matters once they're in law school, at the start of their very first semester. Yeah.
How do you think this book would or could translate to other fields of study that are highly research and academic based in their writing?
Like
History, for example.
So, while I would think it could translate to anyone who writes, I'm not sure it would translate well, for example, to like scientific writing, because it's different. It's just different. But I think any writer, and there was some in the room, and I know I've got published authors on Zoom, my family members. I think it would be helpful really to any writer because comma splices, semicolons, those are things you use when you write. So I guess you could just skim over the case law discussions, which appear in about half the cases, but they do help illustrate the point. So anyway, yeah. All right.
Diana, thank you so much. Thank you.